He's taught at Oxford University for many years. He is a futurist and author. He's written E equals MC squared, which I know we all know exactly what that means. And most recently, he's written Einstein's Greatest Mistake, which is a brilliant read. I'm delighted to have David Bodanis with us today. David, welcome, sir.
Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much for coming along. We normally, David, just start with what we call a quick fire round, just to sort of get to know our guest a little bit more personally. Sort of quick fire answers and quick fire questions. So first of all, a relevant one. What's your favourite Einstein quote, if there's anything that springs to mind?
Einstein was a highly educated man. He believed in knowledge, but he also believed in imagination. And he used to say, imagination, that's more important even than knowledge.
That's brilliant. That's brilliant. And where were you born?
I was born in Chicago, as perhaps you can tell from the accent. But I've lived in England since Callahan was Prime Minister. How's that?
That's pretty good.
Way too long.
And which has got the worst weather, Chicago or the UK?
Chicago has the reputation as the windy city, but apparently from its politicians, not just from the winds from Canada.
I was there in November one year and I bolted for the UK, believe it or not. What's your favourite leadership book, or what's your favourite book that's non-fiction?
For leadership, I find the book of Samuel in the Bible, people say, oh, it's going to be really archaic, it won't be relevant. The book of Samuel in the Bible, I highly recommend. It has issues which would be totally up to date in current elections in the Western world. Yeah. There's lust for power, there's lying, there's subterfuge, there's more subterfuge, more lying, and more lust for power. I believe this applies in many companies today. Final
quick fire question, but who would you like to have for dinner, assuming I'm not available, of course, David, and it could be live or passed away?
I always thought Charles Babbage lived in the early 1800s, and everybody made fun of him. He was trying to invent something with metal cogs and gears and levers and stuff. It was the computer. It had software and all sorts of things, and everybody made fun of him. They said it wasn't going to happen, and he ended his life pretty unhappily. Could you imagine if he could just have a glimpse of us for an hour or two, and we can show him what's on our phone or on our laptops? We say, just take a deep breath and wait. Kind of like Nelson Mandela. When he was in the middle of prison, he didn't know he was going to get out and be revered. Suppose you can give him just a little glimpse of the newspapers. Yeah. Deep breath, 10 years from now, this is going to happen. Wouldn't that be sweet?
This is so sweet. Yeah, you never know what's around the corner, even for us as well.
Yeah.
Thank you for going through that, David, with us. So if we can just talk, before we move on to Einstein and some of his success habits and mantras, etc., you taught at Oxford for a long time, and you taught the intellectual toolkit. Just wanted to know, what the heck is it, and can I buy one?
The great pleasure of creating your own course is nobody can criticize it. Plus, you can talk about whatever you're interested in. So if I were to teach, I don't know, European history or philosophy or something, I would have to know about the field and people could judge me. Yeah. If I say, you know what, we have gaps in knowledge at Oxford. The postgraduate students in, say, doing a PhD in linguistics know a lot about linguistics. They know diddly, I didn't use the word diddly. They know very little about economics or fields like that. People doing a PhD, or what they call there a DPhil in economics, might not know much about anthropology or historical approaches. So I said, what if we have something to fill in the gaps? Wouldn't that be a nice thing to do? And they said, that's a good idea. We need to fill in the gaps. I wasn't criticizing anybody, and then nobody knew exactly what I was doing. Students loved it.
Yeah, did they? What was it they sort of took away the most? Why did they love it so much?
Some of this I didn't talk down to them, and also I was trying to give them principles that would help them. So instead of summarizing whole fields of knowledge, just giving them one or two like lenses or principles they could click on. So if you have a blank piece of paper, you at least have some approach. You could imagine, like suppose you're in business and you say, well, I have a problem. How would Marks and Sparks look at it? Okay? How would Google look at it? How would Amazon look at it? Each would take a different approach, and they might not be a lead to the right answer for you, but automatically they get you started. Yeah. So I would do the same thing, so they could switch on the different lenses of different people.
That's brilliant. So if you come across a problem, it's good to think, you know, Larry Page is in the room, what would he do?
Yeah, you might not necessarily do it, but if you start with, say, 3 or 4 different people, then, and the other thing that works very well in academic problems, and I think in business problems, is if somebody proposes something and you get irritated, listen to the irritation. Somebody says, oh, Larry Page would do this. I say, yeah, but it doesn't apply here because of such and such. The moment you've said such and such, you're at the beginning of your answer.
Right, okay, so listen to the emotions and the thoughts. They've got messages in them. It says on your website that you're passionate about storytelling and ideas. So why those two specifically?
I find it's easier to remember things that way. If things are wrapped up in stories, you can remember it. There's a famous experiment that if you show a chessboard in the middle of a game, if you show it to a chess master, he instantly remembers the pieces, just glancing at it for a second. If you show it to an ordinary putzer, they have no idea what's on there. However, if you take a random arrangement of chess pieces and put it on a board, the chess master can't remember it any better than the ordinary person. Isn't that amazing?
Right.
Because they see the patterns it's going towards. If somebody recites a whole bunch of stuff to you, it's hard to remember it. But if they do it as a rhyme or a poem or a rhythm, it locks in. Similarly for the mantras that will guide a company or an organization. There's some principles are just waffle. Other principles make sense.
Right.
We will find information quickly. It's great. Everybody understands it. It's right in there.
Right. Okay, so it's all about the power of communicating in a way that people can actually remember.
Yes, and the way people remember tends to be stories. Yeah. We also remember insults or humiliation, but that doesn't work very well in motivating your crowd.
Right.
Curiously, sadly, it works incredibly well in politics.
Yeah.
We're being attacked by malicious forces. This applies, the Labour leader can think that about his own party, the Tory leader can think that about her own party.
Yeah.
In fact, all of us can think about that, about the outside world. Yeah. That works well, but it tends to be negative and nasty.
Okay.
Positive stories can build a company better.
Yeah, it's amazing how many vision and mission statements are remarkably unemotional. They're sort of very dry. So you ask somebody in the organisation what it is, nobody knows what it is.
Correct.
So making sure that it's brought to life.
Yeah, if there's a story, it's good. I've looked at mission statements quite a lot, and there's one category of them that work well, and there's a skill in working well. The best research organization in the history of the world was the Cavendish Lab at Cambridge. Right. In one 20-year period, in an area the size of one office floor, they ended up with more Nobel Prizes than all of France, all of Italy, and all of Japan have ever made, ever. Isn't that incredible? And those are great countries. Yeah. And they did it, they had a single mission statement. It wasn't too abstract. You can't remember something abstract like be the best or go get 'em. Doesn't do anything. It wasn't really detailed. It wasn't say, use this equipment under a certain magnification. It was an intermediate level abstraction. They said, let's find out what's inside the atom. Everybody could follow that, but it didn't tell you, it didn't hamstring you. So everybody shared the guidance, but they had a fresh way to do it themselves.
Right.
A mid-level abstraction works well. Think of the companies where everybody understands the mission statement. Yeah. The best service, say, for well-heeled customers, or again, finding knowledge, whatever it is. If it's too abstract, it's dull, nobody cares. And if it's too detailed, it's going to go out of date quickly. Yeah. Einstein, for about 10 or 20 years, had a similar skill in science. He could find the equivalent of mid-level abstractions. He used to say that much of the world, if you look at it, is way too complex to ever understand. Why is there anything? Nobody can understand that. Yeah. Other things are so simple that they're trivial. How does this particular, something tumble down the road? Well, that's easy. It's friction and it's rolling. But find something in between, right at the edge of our knowledge, but which we can still do. This is what people who are the best VCs or the best entrepreneurs, this is what people who are the best entrepreneurs are good at. They see something which is plausible, but isn't yet mastered, and that's what they go for.
Right, okay. And they see something that might have, they have the vision of something that might not be possible now, but they're sort of waiting, or they're developing the technology to be able to build it.
Correct. They have the vision for something that's not possible now, but it's not too far away. There's beautiful ideas in science labs, and VCs know you have to be really careful. If you don't have the intermediate steps to build it, other people might get money from it 10 years from now, not yet. Yeah. Jumping too early is the problem. Yeah. Einstein used to say that he wasn't smarter than other people, and he really wasn't. There were many brilliant physicists in the 20th century, but he had a terrific sense of judgment. Right. And for 20 years, his sense of judgment was exactly right. He would hone in and say, no, don't do that, you won't get anywhere. Look at this problem. This is a ripe problem. Yeah.
And business leaders, like for example, Steve Jobs was very good at that. He was able to spot out of all the various products when he went back from Apple, the iPod, the iPhone. He could have invested in any of them, built on any, but he was able to use his judgment. What advice do you give to business leaders to make sure that they can see the diamonds in all that noise and murky waters?
There's two ways to do it. One is to watch people who've done it really, really well and honestly see what they do, see how they do it. The other way is when you try it, try to get objective feedback. If you say, oh, I think this is going to be a ripe field, either go for it, invest in it a little bit, or if you don't have the time to do that, if you're busy in another job, watch what happens as people do it. And after a while, it's like, remember those old cameras where you overshoot out of focus in one way, out of focus the other, and you get it just right in the middle. So the people who are good at it have feedback. And also, if you make mistakes, make them quickly.
Yeah.
Don't dwell on it. Mr. Jobs famously made many mistakes. He tended to blame other people for the mistakes, but he did make the mistakes, and that allowed him to refine his judgment.
Masterclass in innovation right there. But if you can just tell us, let's start talking about Einstein now, but first of all, where did you get this passion for Einstein? You can clearly speak, on many business subjects. What was the reason for you started to get involved in Einstein?
When I was a little boy growing up in Chicago, I knew that there was a hero for Jewish people like myself.
Yeah.
There was a man that everybody liked and everybody respected, but also, curiously, he was sad. There were photographs of this man who was apparently a great genius. I had no idea what he had invented, but he had a particularly sad face. It was a little bit like the wisdom of Nelson Mandela later, or the wisdom of Martin Luther King. And it felt like he had seen something which the rest of us hadn't, Moses, if you believe in that sort of thing. Mm. And instead of like going off and like living the life of luxury and having his private jets or whatever, he'd come back to Earth to share it. So I felt, here's a really wise man, a representative of my people, and he had seen something which meant a lot to him, but somehow troubled him. As a little boy, I had no idea what that was, and I wanted to find out what it was.
Right, fascinating. What was that?
This was all his science, the theory of relativity and things like that, which I was lucky enough to learn about at university. Mm. And I found that some of my professors, when I got to know them, they'd had the same urge themselves. When they were little, they'd had, isn't so much like looking for a dream of perfection, but they'd wanted to know what was beyond what was known. And who were those people who had gone out there and found it? Who were those people who had gone out there and found it? You know, in the Olympics sometimes, there'll be a sport you normally don't follow. I never follow sprinting. But in the Olympics, I'll watch Mr. Bolt, and I want to see, so is this what the fastest human being on Earth is like? What does he eat for breakfast? How does he run? And how does he do it?
Yeah. What were some of the key personality traits of Einstein? Was he laid back, super highly strung, workaholic, alcoholic?
Yeah. He was really good for two reasons. One is that he studied hard, and he had a terrific persistence. He used to say that I might not be smarter than other people, but I have the persistence of a mule. That was one thing. The other thing that made Einstein good was a whimsical way of stepping back from what everybody else was focused on. Do you know someone like Warren Buffett will often be a counter-cyclical investor? Not counter-cyclical in the sense of doing stocks that go up and down against each other, but doing something which nobody takes into account, something that everybody takes for granted. He'll look under it and say, I wonder about it. When Einstein was a little boy, he got upset when he was 7 years old, and he threw a bowling ball at his sister, his little sister. It hit her in the head. She wrote about it later, and she said, and this shows it takes a thick skull to be the sister of a world-famous physicist. I love that sense of humor in their family. It's like something happens, and instead of just focusing on that thing, you step back. Well, fast forward 20 years, Einstein's at university. Everybody's telling him the world works like this. Victorian science is what's true. And he has that whimsical sense of humor from his family. He's willing to say, maybe, but maybe not.
Yeah, and a great sense of humor is also linked to great intelligence, isn't it? Let's just take E equals MC squared. All of our viewers are very, very smart and well-versed individuals. But for a few people out there, what would you say? Could you just give us a quick definition? I'm sure you've been asked this millions of times, of E equals MC squared. Why is it so flipping important?
Sure. The C squared is what throws people. E stands for energy, M stands for mass. We kind of know what energy is. Energy is like an explosion or something. Mass is like a solid rock, or that small thing inside Donald Trump's skull. You know, so we know what mass is, we know what energy is. What's the C squared? C squared is just a very large number. It's a conversion factor. Between Fahrenheit and centigrade, you have a conversion factor. Between pounds sterling and US dollars, you have a conversion factor. Just a conversion factor. It says if you have a bit of one of these things, it can turn into the other, and by how much? And it turns out C squared is a number. It's a really big number. Trillions and trillions and trillions in ordinary units. So what it means is if you take a tiny little bit of mass, say a single piece of paper, and that mass, when you turn into energy, what's the conversion factor? A little bit of paper, a little bit of mass doesn't become a little bit of energy. Doesn't even become a lot of energy. It becomes an incredible amount of energy. A single piece of paper, if it turned entirely into energy, multiplied by that huge number, the mass multiplied by that number becomes the energy, would be enough to destroy London and just leave a cavernous hole in the surface of the earth where London had been. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, you say in your book, without E equals MC squared, without the equation, for instance, there would be no atomic bomb, no lasers, no internet, and no science of black holes. Do you think 40 years on from 1905, when the US used the atomic bomb, obviously Einstein was still alive at that point, do you think he thought, if I could undo this equation, I would have done?
You're exactly right. Einstein wasn't allowed to work on the atomic bomb project. He'd been a bit of a pacifist when he was younger, but with the rise of Hitler, he thought pacifism is not a good idea. And he would have worked on the atomic bomb project in America, but he wasn't allowed by the FBI. They thought he was a security risk, even though that wasn't true. So he thought that something was going on. He didn't know the details. In 1945, Einstein, when the atomic bomb was dropped on Japan, he was resting on his holiday home on Long Island in New York. in New York State. His secretary woke him and said, I heard this terrible thing on the news. The atomic bomb has been used. And he looked at her. Her name was Helen Dukas. And he said, if I had known, I wouldn't have lifted a finger.
Right. Okay. Isn't that amazing? But I suppose he had no idea at the time that that would have led itself into that. Why did you decide to write then Einstein's greatest mistake? What was the reason for that follow-up? Was it equals MC squared? It was turned into a film, a radio documentary, huge. Why this book?
Curiously, I recently I saw the movie Spaceballs with Mel Brooks, and somebody asked the Yoda character in that film, what's the secret of the universe? And he says, marketing. It's all about marketing. Suppose you write a book called Why Einstein's Smarter Than You and We're All a Bunch of Dumb Schmucks. Nobody's interested in that. Yeah. But suppose you write a book about Einstein had a real problem. We can console him, we could help him, and we can learn from his mistakes. We can become smarter than Einstein. Right. Isn't that interesting? And to find out, for example, that Usain Bolt was a good runner when he was a kid wouldn't be that surprising. To find out that Usain Bolt had been a poor runner as a child, that he'd been picked on, that he'd been short or something, that'd be really interesting. How did he turn it around? Similarly with Einstein, everybody knew he was smart. If I said even more smartness about Einstein, I'd say, But to find out that he made a terrible mistake, and then I found out it was a psychological mistake, that's really interesting. A scientific mistake, you say, well, that's interesting only for scientists. Yeah. But a psychological mistake, and I got to tell you, when Einstein made a mistake, he made a big one. Yeah. We can learn from it. How cool is that?
That's very cool. Being smarter than Einstein, but learning from Einstein is a great premise. I know this is the type of thing I do, David, so whilst I've got it on my memory, what was Einstein's greatest mistake, or do we have to read the book to find that one out?
I wouldn't mind terribly if you read the book. I'm not sure, but I think it communicates much better at retail in hardcover than in the softcover edition. Yeah. Sorry, apologize to people who are doing the softcover. His mistake was one of arrogance and hubris. At one point in his life, he found out that listening to experimental evidence had been proven wrong. People told him something was the case, and he said, are you sure? They said, yeah. So he changed what he was doing, and later he found out that they were wrong. So he decided after that, he made a psychological mistake. I was burned once by listening to people's evidence. I'm not going to listen to evidence again. If I'm really convinced that there's a beautiful, clear explanation of things, that's got to be how things are. He realized he had been wrong to listen to evidence before, so he decided, I'm not going to listen to evidence again. Didn't hold. Einstein is famous for saying, God does not play dice with his universe. His good friend Niels Bohr used to say, Einstein, stop telling God what to do.
Right, okay. That's absolutely fascinating, because you say in your book, the trick is to surf the line between the supple and the stubborn without falling too far on either side. So
this happens for example, they often say, I will tell you how to get a lot of money in the stock market, guaranteed. What you do is you buy low and you sell high. Well, that's trivial. The question is, where is it right now? Is it low or is it high? Do you see that? Right. So they always say, I know how to succeed in business. Reinforce victory, step away from defeat. But suppose you just start marketing something a little bit. It's not selling that well, your profits are low. Do you step away because it's a guaranteed defeat? Or you say, no, a little bit more effort will make it work. At what point do you switch? You need a sense of judgment.
Yeah, absolutely. And that judgment, I mean, it's interesting because a lot of people say you need as a leader, for example, to have a huge self-confidence and to back your own judgment. But then that on its own, without the ability to be humble enough to listen to other smart advisors, is not enough in itself. So how do you, as a leader, do you actually create that balance of self-confidence versus listening?
I've had the great opportunity in researching other projects to spend a lot of time with some top business leaders and also some top leaders in other fields, some top commanders in the British and American armies, some top surgeons, people who've organized large groups of people acting well. And what they tend to do is divide their approach into two parts. Backstage, they're really open to evidence and information. People can brief them, they'll listen, they'll express uncertainty to their closest friends. Then once they make a decision, they're absolute and confident. Not cocky, but they express a matter-of-fact confidence. The people who only do that second stage, think of the people who appear to be like Steve Jobs. I'm going to be arrogant and I'm going to be insistent. Usually they're wrong. They're just flailing and showing off, like a teenage boy strutting and pretending to be tougher and more knowledgeable than he is. So you need the two stages. Quietly, maybe when nobody's looking, you learn. Then once you do know, for the people who need to follow you, you're matter of fact. Right. The trick there for that second stage, and again I get this more from the military people than business ones, though some of the successful business ones have it, is not to either lean forward or to lean back when you're leading. In a situation of violence, like a potential danger on the street, people tend to lean back like, "Ooh, stay away from me, man," or "I'm scared." Or they lean forward and say, "What are you saying?" Very aggressive.
Right.
The people who stand utterly calmly in the middle, neither forward nor back, tend to be left alone. Or they tend to, people quietly, they listen to their quiet words.
Interesting. Yeah, because we interviewed Daniel Kahneman, author of Think Fast, Think Slow, and he was saying very similar things. He said, if system 2 thinking is your immediate gut response versus system 1, but you've got to use both systems,
Correct.
not one in isolation to the other.
Someone like Kahneman really has it nailed. And I suppose the thing that what a good business or other leader can do is take those 2 stages, but do them at different times. One should be in public, one can be in private.
Yeah, that's right. That's why you can debate and have, all the CEOs we've interviewed say they've got 1 or 2 advisors that they speak to privately about their own insecurities or doubts, and then they use that as a sort of basis to come back and have the confidence to go forward. Would you say Einstein, you said that Einstein isn't the smartest, well, there's other people obviously smarter than him, but was it his brilliant brain, or was there some success habits or productivity habits, thinking habits that enabled him to get so far? I'm asking that question to see what we can learn, like somebody wrote a book saying, think like Einstein,
Whenever there's somebody who's at the absolute top of the game, there's some aspects of what they do that we can't copy. Usain Bolt has unusually long legs. I'm guessing he has a lot of fast twitch muscle. You're born with that or you're not. On the other hand, there are several parts of Usain Bolt's training career which we really can learn from. He had great confidence. The Jamaican team is cocky. They're proud. They're going to do well. And we know that companies or organizations or certain film studios can be really cocky and proud in a really good way. He puts in the hours. He does interval training, but not too long. He has proper recovery times. Those things we can all learn from. It might not bring him up to, it might not bring us up to his level, but it can do a lot. Yeah. Similarly for Einstein, some of what he had was just, he was Einstein. His son ended up teaching hydraulic engineering at Berkeley in California. And somebody said to him, "Don't you feel bad being Einstein's son? Do you feel inadequate?" He said, "My father was Einstein. What am I going to do? He's Einstein. How can I compete?" So given that, we can't automatically be like it. But Einstein did several things which we can all follow. One, this is really, really boring. He studied hard. How dull is that? He really made sure that he amassed the appropriate information, summarized it, and really learned it in his head. Wow. Yeah. He kept up to date, at least when he was young, with what was going on. When he had to learn things that weren't being taught properly, he would go to the side and take time to quietly do it on his own. He had 2 or 3 best friends who he could really share things with in an informal way. And also he was able to step back when he was frustrated and with a sense of humor look back at things.
Right. That's brilliant.
Those are useful.
Because you talk about work ethic. I mean, back in 1905 in your book, he came up with, it says in your book, you said he worked 6 days a week. I think he's working for the patent office, as you said. 6 days a week, 8 hours a day at his day job. But then in the same year, he wrote a paper, he was coming up with basically how to measure atoms, light, E equals mc squared, and general relativity. So how on earth, I mean, I'm working for Informer. I've won a tennis match, I think, outside of work hours. But that's about, how on earth did he manage to do all of that whilst having a full-time job with a micromanager boss, I understand, at the patent office?
When he was young, he was trained at one of the best German-speaking universities in the world. It was in Switzerland. And then he spent a few years sort of in isolation, thinking really hard about these problems. He didn't get anywhere, but he was thinking about them, he was rolling over them in his head. You know, sometimes like you've been rolling over a problem, even if it's a trivial problem, you step in the shower or you're taking the tube or something, and instantly you get the answer. Yeah. Clearly your brain was cogitating, and briefly the door opens. That's what happened to Einstein in 1905. He'd been well trained, and then he'd been pulled away from the fire for a while, being on his own. Then he knew he had to put it together. In 1905, a door opened. Another thing that helped him write the papers when he was working those long hours in Switzerland was what I call the getting ready for the airport effect. If you know you're going to the airport later in the evening, you'll spend the day putzing, at least if you're like me. And if you wake up too late and you have to get to the airport in 32 minutes, you can't do it. It's not possible. But if you wake up maybe an hour after your alarm should have gone off and you say, I got to pack fast, you'll do it. All the self-consciousness and the second guessing you would have done disappears. That's one reason that people often do well on, students will often leave things till deadline, and people at an office often like leaving things not quite to the last minute, but they're doing it just before they go home. Another thing that helps is if you don't have the pressure to be perfect. Informally writing things informally on envelopes is really good. Working quietly in the evening when, well, you can maybe spend another half hour, you can redo it. When Einstein came up with these ideas in 1905, nobody knew what he was doing. Nobody was watching him, nobody was checking, nobody was second guessing. If something didn't work, he could put it to the side. Too little pressure can make you vague. Too much pressure makes you only do what people expect of you.
I mean, Einstein, obviously, as you say in the book, had the persistence of a mule, and he actually said, "I'm not that smart. It's just that I stay with problems longer." But I suppose if you're, like you just mentioned there, if you are really passionate about doing something, but you're not good at it, then you're just going to go round and round in circles like a dog chasing its tail. You're not going to get very far, right? You've got to bring those two things together.
Yes, a passion itself isn't enough. People say, I'm very passionate about this. It's a start, but it's not enough. You can go in a circle. You need skill. Often what people are passionate about, it fits the world for a certain amount of time, but then the world changes.
Yeah.
Some people are great at a certain stage of business development, but then when things become different, think of the shift from Microsoft to Google.
Yeah.
There's a way that Microsoft used to be able to do things 20 years ago. It worked really well. There were certain rhythms of time. There was solid physical objects that were done. Think of Google, even better, think of Facebook. It's a different rhythm. Very few people can go from one of those companies to another. The detailed software engineers, of course, can, but the people on top who have a vision, I want to make this solid object in people's homes, it's very different from the ones who say, I want to have this experience be shared by other people.
Yeah.
When I mentioned about mid-level abstractions, there's famous Cavendish lab at Cambridge in England, which was great. It was great, but only for 20 years. After about 20 years, that abstraction, find what's inside the atom, stopped working. Couldn't work anymore. We had worked out our technology. It was only when people shifted to other mid-level abstractions that they did better. If you think about the great companies in Britain and America and around the world, they usually have one shtick, you might say is a technical word, one approach. It usually doesn't last that long.
Okay, so therefore adaptability and agility and constantly reinventing yourself, like Goldman Sachs is known to have done, essential for organizational survival and I suppose individual survival as well.
Correct. Well, there's two sorts of large successful organizations. There's some that can keep on doing the same thing, such as a Shell or Exxon, and there you have to execute really well, with some adjustments for the external world, but you just have to execute well. There's others where you need to be supple and change direction, be it every 5 years or every 15 years. Very occasionally, there's an individual who can do it. This is rare. Usually the organizations have a wonderful approach. They take individuals who've done really good things and they get rid of them. Sometimes they get rid of them by making them ceremonial CEOs. Yeah. Other times they fire them or whatever it is. So they have to change what's there. It's similar to human evolution. If nobody ever died, could you imagine the people who are waiting to succeed Jeremy Corbyn would have to wait for 400 years?
That'd be pretty disastrous, wouldn't it, for the UK? What would you, one of the things you say, the purpose of this book as well, talking about change and longevity and things, is that Einstein went through a period of difficulty almost in the aging process. Was there anything that we learned from that, how to stay young forever, before they invent genes or anything, a gene stem cell thing that can solve that from a mental perspective that we should be doing?
What made Einstein age more quickly than other physicists of his same chronological age was that he became stuck in his past successes. I think the people you meet in their 60s and 70s and 80s who are really cool and energetic and doing stuff, think of Clint Eastwood. He's in his mid-80s, right? He's doing great films. His new film, Sully, it's a good film. Letters from Iwo Jima, excellent. He was doing things in his 70s and 80s. In interviews, Clint Eastwood hardly ever talks about what he did 20, 30, or 40 years ago. He doesn't brag. He doesn't even live in that world. He does like jazz piano, so he will play classics. But that's okay. That's not his main professional skill. In movies and films, he's always watching for new things. It doesn't mean to trivialize what you did before. You need to be proud. You need to be confident. But you can't show off about them. You have to let them disappear. Otherwise, you're a blatted copybook.
Yeah, it's true. In fact, George W. Bush, I think, on Nelson Mandela's 90th birthday party, asked him, "What's next, Nelson?" And he said, well, "Now you're at the top, what's next?" He said, there is no top, it doesn't exist. You've got to climb another mountain. So just constantly setting yourself new goals.
Good point.
Let's go back to 1905. One of the things you mentioned there is obviously Einstein's ability to spend time thinking. So if we can just learn from Einstein for a moment, or discuss what are some of the thinking strategies that he deployed. We interviewed Edward de Bono, the author of The Six Thinking Hats, who basically said that we don't spend enough time thinking, particularly in management and leadership. Well, the only time we really spend time thinking is on problem solving as opposed to goal attainment. But I suppose, is there anything that you think we can learn from Einstein in terms of his thinking successes that we can deploy ourselves?
Yes, very much. The key thing is the ability to listen. When I worked at Shell Scenarios, the guy who was head of it, Judd Davis, was a wonderful man. He ended up at Davos. And he wore 2 hearing aids. And he used to say, I can't hear very well, but I listen extremely well. It turns out that when you listen to a problem, really listen, you connect with the people who are aware of the problem, so you learn about them, they feel motivated, but also the problem becomes less difficult, it becomes less impossible. If you go over the terms of the problem and come to understand it, the distance between where you are and where the problem is, it becomes less far. It's not a faraway, mysterious thing. You say, oh, I see, there's these components and those components. So that's what Einstein did. Curiously, Isaac Newton did the same thing several hundred years ago, several hundred years before. They just worry it over until it gets closer and closer to them, and then there's only a small jump needed.
Okay. I understand also that he took some time walking and reflecting. I mean, you mentioned earlier that if you've got some deadline or some pressure, it can actually aid you in eureka moments. But then on the flip side, there's the Daniel Goleman, for example, said, have a bath if you want to come up with the next big idea.
Yeah. So in many of these things, it's the matter of trade-off. If you only reflect, well, nothing happens. And if you only obsess, nothing happens. You need to obsess about it, worry about it, think about it. And again, if possible, try to listen to people who are presenting the problem. Really understand what the terms of the problems are.
Yeah.
And then at that point, and then you'll know your own cognitive style. For Einstein, it was nice walks in the mountains outside Bern, Switzerland. He used to like really smelly cheeses and stuff, and he was and drinking beer. He also liked mocha, a little bit of coffee, a little bit of chocolate in his coffee made him feel very good. Yeah. That itself is just the surface. That isn't what makes it work. What makes it work is thinking about these problems, if possible, that you care about. Some people say, I'm going to go into advertising because it'll be fun. Other people go into advertising because they're really interested. They want to get this thing across. Some people go into tech because there's money to be made. Other people who are often more successful go into tech because there's a product they're really excited about. John Kay, the English commentator who writes for the FT and other places, wrote a book called The Principles of Obliquity. Isn't that great? Yeah. If you aim for one thing, you're likely to succeed at something else. Right. When Marks and Spencer used to aim for making a great service, turns out they got a lot of money. You have to be sensible with accounting and be aware of cash flow and things like that. Similarly, suppose you really want to be happy. You don't sit around with your friends and say, let's be really happy today and perky, like in a Disney movie. You do certain stuff, and afterwards you look back and say, that was a great day, right? It has to be oblique. It has to be at a slight angle to what the final product is.
Right, which goes back to your earlier mission statement, keeping it quite open.
Correct.
Allows people to achieve that however they go about thinking to do so. The aim of education must be the training of independently acting and thinking individuals whoever see in their service to the community their highest life problems. So in other words, training them to think individually. How education, I don't think today necessarily does that. You have to follow the... How should one, if we're parents watching this, raise our kids to have that balance of being told what to do and actually come up with their own ideas of what to do in the first place?
One time I was speaking about Einstein in Korea to a big crowd, there were several hundred, and a woman came up to me with her 2 terrified little sons next to her, and she said, tell me immediately how to make them be like Einstein. Tell me the 6 rules, and I will make damn sure that they follow them exactly. I was tempted to say, honey, first, lay off. Let them rest, let them play. Yeah. Also, maybe they don't want to be like Einstein. Maybe they want to, be quite different. Yeah. So one is the thing of allowing somebody's, not so much their obsession, but their genuine interest to come out. Francis Crick, the man who won the Nobel Prize for DNA, who shared it with James Watson, he said, follow the gossip test. There's things that you spontaneously bore your friends with. Say, oh God, he's going to start talking about that again. That's what you gossip about is usually a sign of what you're really interested in. Yeah. Some people work in tech, but they love how people interact. They should work in marketing. Some people work in marketing, but oh God, I can manipulate people, they don't like it, but they're fascinated by new interfaces. Do you see what my watch is doing? They should work in graphical user interfaces. So your gossip will show you where you are. Einstein was fascinated by what he called the old one, this force. He wasn't an atheist. He looked down on atheists. He felt sorry for them. But he wasn't a traditional religious believer. He was, as you might expect, halfway in between. And he was fascinated, where did the structure of the universe come from? He thought that we were like a little boy. He once gave this image, a little boy walking into a room lined with books. Very occasionally, the brightest members of our species are allowed to take out one of the books, open a page and look on it and see what's written there. Those are the truths of the universe. Einstein wanted to be one of the people who did that.
Right, beautiful. And one of the things you were passionate about, speaking about, is how creativity actually works. So, in a nutshell, how does creativity work?
I think there's a magic in how creativity works. This isn't helpful, but if you think about it, if there was a formula, we would all follow it. A real genius is somebody who does things that you can't imagine knowing how to do. There's some people who are better than you. Well, for example, I like to run. Mr. Bolt runs a lot faster than me, but it doesn't surprise me. I could imagine if I was endowed with longer legs and better muscles and a little bit younger, I could understand what it's like to run faster. However, people on the uneven parallel bars, I can't imagine that. Or open floor gymnastic exercise, it's inconceivable to me. Yeah. So there's some things in the business world that you realize other people do better than you, but you can imagine doing it. Somebody, he's a junior on a production company. They look around, they really follow their boss. They can see how to run a production company. And if they're smart, they'll get feedback all the time. They'll have provisional ideas, see what works and what doesn't work. Similarly in different sorts of business. So there's some things you can imagine doing better at. There's other things that you look at and say, where did that come from? How do they do that? And those are fields perhaps to invest in, but not to try to compete in yourself.
Right, got it, absolutely. I don't think I could do the running or the bars. Creativity is an increasingly important trait of leaders. More and more people in the hiring departments are looking for people that are creative. But what would you say is one of the core pillars of creativity and making sure that you're actually doing well when it comes to creativity?
The people who are genuinely creative tend to be able to do two things at once. One, they can make the creativity work. An abstract idea that is unconnected to the world around you, it won't connect. Something that you can't develop in mathematics if you're in programming, something that you can't do with other people if human resources can't supply it, that's useless. It's actually not creative. It's the wanderings and cries of a wild man going through the desert. So that's one, it has to work. The other thing that makes creativity happen is that the person involved, the key person involved, cares about it. They're interested in it objectively, not just for other reasons. When you get someone who really cares about a certain problem, they'll think about it until this magical jump happens in their synapses in their brain. And then, if they're really, really good, they can get other people around them to understand it and bring it in. Einstein came up with wonderful ideas in 1905 when he was 26, isolated in barren Switzerland. It took several years before people recognized it, but when they did, it resonated with them. They saw, this is a man I want to work with.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting because you mentioned about caring about the impact your ideas have on the world. And if you look at Jeff Bezos, for example, or any of the major leaders out there, they all seem to have an obsession about their customers solving problems and their unmet needs. And so if you put that first as opposed to the money, then it can have huge success. Talk about Jeff Bezos. He's a great leader. You've written a lot about leadership. People come to you for your leadership advice. And before our interview, you talked about the leadership elections going on in the US at the moment. In a nutshell, what would you say is great leadership? What are the attributes of a great leader?
I once had the honor of being at a small dinner with Jeff Bezos in Monterey, California. Just about 4 or 5 people. It was a quiet dinner in the wintertime and stuff. And he did something very interesting. He listened to what people were saying at the table. He wasn't strutting, he wasn't showing off, and he didn't do the thing like, well, I'm going to pretend to listen, I'm going to give pearls of wisdom. He genuinely was brighter and more insightful after the dinner than before. I thought, this is a man who's on the path. Isn't that great?
Yeah.
He had no need to show off and let us know that he was like a rich man with a successful company.
Yeah.
We knew that already.
Yeah, it's one of the traits I think of all the people we've interviewed is that they're nice and to a certain extent, and they certainly listen and they're empathetic. Do you think those are the traits that they've had all the way along that has got them to their top, or do you think they've got to the top and they're relaxed because they're now the CEO of Amazon, for example, worth hundreds of billions?
I think there's 2 paths to the top. I'm interested because one of the next books I'm going to write is called Nice Guys Finish First, at least sometimes, and here's how. There's a way to the top which is not being nice at all. I have a friend who works in the garment trade, like the big retail fashion and stuff in New York City. And lying, unscrupulous jerks rise to the top very quickly. Everybody hates their guts. The moment they show any weakness, they're brought down very quickly. The knives are out. Being decent, forming alliances, sharing credit, usually takes longer, but it's more robust. If you look at almost any field, there's those 2 sorts of people rise. I won't mention names for legal reasons, but we know who they are. In banking and high tech, the reputation's there. And the really jerky way often works. Bullies are often very successful, baring their teeth outward. Screaming often works quite well within a company. People are scared of you, so it does well.
Yeah.
Toting up to the boss, stealing credit. All those can work. It's a possible path, but it's not the only possible path. There's another possible path where the guy, John Warnock, who's head of Adobe Photo Systems, is a really kind, decent man. He shares credit, So people know if they work with him, credit goes down there. He'll be firm. Sometimes he's had to fire people, but you can fire people without being malicious or nasty about it. You don't have to give them a cardboard box and kick them out within 20 minutes.
Right.
You know, help with retraining, you know, be honest and sincere. Also, there's better information transfer. If a boss is nice and decent, people will speak to him. When Einstein was early in his career, he could share information and people would share information with him. They knew that he was going to be open, he was receptive. When he was older and closed off to quantum mechanics, it was a waste of time to try to give him information. It made him more and more isolated. An office that's run by terror, the heck you're going to tell your boss anything, you know you'll just get an earful. People in airplane cockpits have had to study that a real lot. Many of the major accidents in the last 20 or 30 years came because the co-pilot didn't dare say a word to the pilot. Isn't that something?
Right.
And many airlines, especially from cultures which are very hierarchical, have had to change the rules, and they practice the new psychology inside a cockpit that the most junior person can pass on information. The captain has to listen.
So what you're saying is there's two routes. There's a route of being ruthless like that, but there's also sort of a more of a collaborative building approach, and both work.
Both are possible. Now, some fields make it easier than others. To be a quiet academic, it's easier to be like gentle and sit around. There can be backbiting there, but the stakes are slight. The truly vicious people won't waste their time because the salaries are small. Media is famous for having a backbiting because the stakes are enormous and service appearance is really important. Technical people are usually better, or any technical thing, because you can objectively judge what it is. People who do karate at high international levels usually have something, they're kind of weird in the head because it's often done by touch. People who do long jump, it's like, it's objective. You just jump and see who can jump longer. Divers, for example, tend to be terribly neurotic because it's just a number. Swimmers in 50 or 100 meters, occasionally they can be spoiled idiots, as certain American swimmers have demonstrated in Rio. But they tend not to be superstitious. They just, it's objective. Let's get in the pool and see who's better. Why am I obsessed with the Olympics now? I have no idea.
We'll have to get Usain Bolt for you to come and meet one day. Hopefully we're going to interview him. It's part of my 25-year plan to get him to come and do an interview with us. Let's just talk about the future. You're a futurist as well. You worked at the Royal Dutch Shell Prediction Unit and also at the World Economic Forum. So one of the things we always say at leadership is you've got to keep a finger on the pulse of what's coming up next. And you've talked about that already today to some extent with making sure you don't stay complacent and focus on future goals. But how can you keep a finger on the pulse of what's coming up next?
It turns out that almost everything that we use now, everything around us, was actually available in research labs or in think tanks 10, 15 years ago. If you go around, like our iPhones, the latest ones, were being thought of 5, 10, 15 years ago. Many of the ways we interact, the ideas behind Uber and all sorts of things that are changing the business world and changing technology. So what I do is I spend a lot of time going to research labs and also think tanks and stuff, seeing what's there, and then being suspicious about it. There's a lot of ideas that are floating around that never come to fruition. So what you have to do is think, what social setting or what legal setting is going to allow it to happen? The technology of driverless cars is really quite good. What's going to happen legally? Will people freak at the inevitable accidents and block it? America's a highly litigious culture. Or will people say, well, this is wonderful, mobility for older people, mobility for the handicapped, less pollution as more cars are used. So the mixture of two things, what's technologically available, we can see that 10 years in advance. It's sitting in the labs right now. The stuff we use in 2020 or 2023, it's not going to be stuff that doesn't exist now. It's stuff that'll come out of the labs. The question is, which ones will come out? What's the sieve and what's the filter? One of the pleasures when I work with big companies is they can make it happen. Smaller companies have to warily watch, like mammals when dinosaurs are still around. Just get a feeling, what are the big guys going to allow to come out? And maybe they can have an early glimpse.
Right. And what advice would you give to large organizations on innovation? Would you suggest that they build their own innovation center, testing new ideas, or would you say just leave that to the startups and wait for them to be successful enough to prove that they've got something that works in a prototype and then just acquire them?
The big pharmaceuticals know that their own labs are not especially cost effective. However, by having great scientists on board, they can judge the boutique startups very, very well. They know what the literature is and they can see where things are going. Occasionally they'll hit the jackpot, like Mr. Black, who came up with beta blockers in the UK. Magnificent invention. And that was in-house. But usually having scientists in-house means you're aware of the field. It also imbues the company with something more positive. Years ago, Air France was putting secret microphones in their first class seats from California to Paris. And the French government was trying to learn the secrets of Silicon Valley by listening in. Do you know how depressing that is if you were working in high tech in France? This is a long time ago under Mitterrand, and people said, well, you'll never be able to come up with it yourself. You'll have to steal from somebody else. That's no good. The advantage of doing it yourself is that you have confidence.
Yeah.
That famous lab that I was talking about, the Cavendish lab at Cambridge, their main success was finding mid-level abstractions. Not too abstract, not too detailed. But along with that, they did three other things that really helped, that put them the best lab in the history of the world ever for 20 years. One, they pulled the electricity at 6 p.m., turned it off. You could stay there as long as you wanted, but the rooms were going to be dark and wouldn't work. So people had to focus their time. Two, the other thing they did is they help people with visas. It's kind of embarrassing if you have a visa problem, but if somebody helps you you can work in a new country, you're eternally grateful. And the third thing they did was say, we're not going to copy the other guys. Let's make our own tools. There was a young grad student from Germany who wanted to see how could you tell when radiation is going on. His name was Hans Geiger. At the lab, he invented the Geiger counter.
Right. Yeah.
They were right ahead of everybody. People later, in a year or two, could copy it. Doesn't matter. The Cavendish lab had found all the nice low-hanging fruit first.
Yeah, beautiful. That's amazing. We should definitely learn from that. And I think sort of switching the lights off at 6 o'clock as well. I think it would stop people doing unneeded social chat and Facebook updates and all that type of stuff.
Think about if you have to send short emails.
Yeah.
Think about if there's a limit of 300 words on like an email for strategy.
Yeah.
You really have to focus.
That's it. And as Einstein said, what did he say? Something about as simple but not too simple? Get it as simple as you can but not too simple.
Correct.
If we can just end today with just a question, I guess, about technology and its potential future. I mean, Einstein was one of the greatest brains on the planet. There's a talk about machine intelligence, augmented reality, virtual reality, and everything else. But from a machine intelligence perspective, do you think that one day machine intelligence will be able to get the same level as Einstein, if not surpass him, and have consciousness as well?
Looking at our history, machine intelligence shows every sign of getting better and better and better. One of the problems that Einstein saw looking around him politically, he said that modern weapons, what modern science does, is it puts like machine guns in the hands of primitives. And we don't want to do that. Einstein himself tried to regulate the use of the weapons that came from his ideas, and he was totally unsuccessful. Machine intelligence will have no emotional feelings. They won't be for it, they won't be against it. They'll be utterly neutral. Now, it is true that scientists in the past have not been very successful in making sure that their stuff is used well. Business has been neither good nor bad about it. It just floats on. But with machine intelligence, we still need political oversight or social oversight to make sure it doesn't just race away from us in what's efficient, but maybe not very humane.
Yeah, it's interesting. Because I think Steve Wozniak, who we're interviewing on LeadersIn very soon, he was saying that the danger becomes when the machine is intelligent enough to realize that you could unplug them and switch them off. That's when you've got some real issues coming up. Imagining for a moment that Einstein was 1905 and 1925, around that time. Is there anyone that you think in 60, 70 years' time will be looking back on today thinking that they were the Einstein of 2017, 16?
What I find very exciting is that a few hours before Einstein got famous, nobody knew who he was, aside from his family. So the person who's going to be looked back on 50 or 60 years from now, way in the middle of our century or late in our century, is probably going to be somebody, statistically, because of how the Earth's population is, probably somebody from Malaysia or from China. Could be a boy or could be a girl. There's less sexism now than in Einstein's time. It's probably going to be somebody who had a family that nurtured him, but where he or she didn't entirely fit in. Somebody who had access to good education, which could be through the internet, massive online course, could be a top university, but then who spent some time on their own. Could be in Silicon Valley, could be the similar thing in Malaysia or some other place like that. And they'll be thinking really, really, really hard. And you know what? In a couple months from now, they're going to be discovered.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned the one thing you said there, or makes sense to me, except for spending time on their own. Why is that important?
Almost everybody who's been really successful steps away from the mainstream, not for too long, but for a little while. There was a journalist in West London in the early 1960s whose friends were going off to be a journalist. And what he did, this was when an area called Notting Hill was little known and very cheap. Mm-hmm. He used to lie in a hammock with his fingers entwined behind his head, and his friends would go off to work and say, "Tom, you lazy so-and-so, what are you doing?" He said, "I'm going to think." And he thought like that for a couple of weeks. And when they came back, Tom stoppered. had come up with the idea for Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead.
Right.
He needed to think and mull. If he had stayed like that for several years, perhaps with drugged help, nothing would have happened.
Yeah.
But if he had been as a busy journalist day to day with no break from the deadlines, he wouldn't have done it either. You need a moderate pause.
Right. And so do you think the best organizations today, like I'm thinking Google, I went to their Google head offices in London at least a few months ago, and it looked like they were equipped with bean bags and pools. I mean, is that all in order to you sort of do the organizational design to allow for creativity and thinking?
Usually that fails. Companies like Microsoft have tried that, Xerox tried that. People try it. It's a fake break or fake creativity. It's within the constraint of the large company. Plus, the people who've joined large companies have already said, wow, I'm joining something that everybody thinks is famous. I fulfill the hurdles of something that's going to give me a high guaranteed salary. Those tend not to be creative, original people.
Right, okay. So sort of getting yourself out of the office and lying down for 2 hours in the park, I can now explain that to my boss that I'm doing the required thinking that David Bodanis told me about.
The man who came up with the title for Einstein's greatest mistake is a good friend of mine in New York, Mark Hurst. He'd had a really successful job. In his mid-20s, he was selected to speak at TED. I think he got a standing ovation. A great guy. He took a pause. He took a break. It was a great job. He went to do something different. And instead of just lying in the park for a while or playing on a beanbag, he went on a tour around America, seeing some old friends and thinking for 3 months, 4 months. And when he came back, he came up with a wonderful idea. He created a new sort of conference and a new business forum, which has been really successful for about 20 years now. Yeah. So if he had stayed away for too long, who knows, you would lose it. Knowing Mark, he would be okay. Yeah. So a little break in the park, you're still constrained by this large organization you're in. But a break of a little bit of a half sabbatical, a summer away, even a month, that can do wonders.
I'm going to put my vacation request in for 3 months and
That's a good call.
Any complaints, I'll pass them on to you, Do.
I'll back it up.
David, on behalf of all of our viewers watching and for myself, I just want to say it's been an honor meeting you. Thank you very much indeed for your time. I really do appreciate it. Thank you.
A great pleasure. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Good.